Hello, everyone, and welcome again to our podcast, Muslim Youth Matters, where we are meeting with experts and witnesses from the community to better understand the challenges and the issues faced by our youth and perhaps some of the barriers for them fully integrating. So today we have Mohamed Sofa. Mohammed, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for
Uh,
having me.
Thank you very much. And let's start very quickly with some introductions. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations on starting this important conversation and dialogue for our community. My name is Mohamed Sofa. I currently work at United Way East Ontario. I grew up here in Ottawa. I came here in the mid 90s as an immigrant, as a refugee, with my sister and her children, and I was separated from my parents. And began to live in this beautiful city. But for me, it was a new world, and that I have never experienced or even imagined coming to. And over the years, I've learned to live in this community, and through the struggles and success and
Hmm.
challenges and the pains, I kept going forward and being active in my community. And I'm glad to join you guys here today to talk a little bit of what I do and how I got here.
That would be great. Thank you for sharing this personal journey with us. Um, so, growing up as someone who is coming from the outside and trying to integrate into this very different world, very different society, um, what are some of the things that you started noticing, experiencing, seeing in the greater world as a little child?
Well, when you're a younger, I came here when I was about 12, and that's grade 7 and 8 sort of time. I was completely confused and out of touch. I remember, when I came here, I was put in a class called ESD, which was below ESL. So essentially, is this is like development of the basic literacy and language and so on. And within 2 years, um, I fought myself out of that, and I skipped even the ESL, English as Second Language classes, and went to the regular mainstream.
Mhm.
And I remember through that process that there are so many challenges that some are systemic and some are because of personal um, limitations and just journeys that you have to
Mhm.
go through. But the biggest challenge I remember seeing is that sometimes the community you come to is just isn't ready for you,
Mhm.
and you have to find ways to be part of that community and to belong. And for me, that was really what I noticed from the get go, and that's why I really got involved in community. It was just seeing that there were so many gaps in supports, in recognizing the challenges that individuals faced. Something as simple as gathering space
Mhm.
for communities. And we're not even talking about complex supports and big investment, but simple things. So that's how really we began to fight for spaces. Can we have a place to just drop in and gather and talk to each other and get to know each other and organize? So those are some of the basic challenges, and then from there, as your first 2 years, you're actually pretty dazed and you're figuring things out. You're figuring out what direction is north and which is south and which bus to take to which location. But I think as you settle, you realize that you're behind everybody else, and you don't have that network, the
Mhm.
mentors, the community connections, the financial means, and all of that means that you're gonna struggle harder than most people, especially if you landed here with multi-generational family, with as refugees, as people who have limited language, limited planning to arrive to Canada. You didn't immigrate, you came literally with a backpack on your in your hand, and landed in an airport somewhere. So figuring things out was hard and it was really challenging. And some of my friends paid the ultimate price for not being prepared and lost their lives because of choices and realities and systemic influences that have impacted their lives. So it was hard being, part of that journey. 20 plus years now, I look back, and there's still much more to do. And there are people who are still struggling. And that work is important, and community must carry that work with our within our system, and also sometimes by themselves.
Hmm. So you said you started noticing these issues, and obviously some of this stuff needed to be done, and so you step up to some of it and you get involved. What does that look like? And tell me a little bit about that journey to all the way to today.
Oh my God! So that journey is if you open your eyes, you learn from your community, and if you care enough about people, you get to see challenges. And most of us usually step in when we see somebody fall, and we go out to help. I think community building is the same. And for me, that was sort of it was a knee jerk reaction, uh, responding to issues around me. It started. Yeah, I remember when we were playing basketball, there was a team that didn't have our team didn't have a coach, and I was the 17-year-old in the neighborhood. And I'm there, I'm 5'7", 5'8", and then there were guys who were like 6'8", 6'9" on the team, and I stepped up to coach the team instead of playing. I coached the team. I continue to coach that team and support that team to date. It's been 20 years.
Hmm.
To be honest with you, it started because there was no one else there to pick that to do that job, and it evolved. I became an assistant, a manager, a volunteer, a supporter, a champion, a resource person over the years as my life changed, my roles changed. But
Hmm.
it was that simple. And then and then there were little things like homework clubs for young children who are behind schools. How do we support those? How do we fight for recreational space? There were beautiful buildings near our community, but we called them the graveyard at the time because they were always locked.
Hmm.
And advocating all the way to City Hall and working with our city councilor at the time uh, to make change
Yeah.
and open spaces for young people. Imagine we were from large families. A lot of especially at that time, we had a lot of immigrant families from Africa and Middle East and different parts of the world, and every house had seven or eight, five, four. That was the average person in the house, and mostly young. And between Thursdays and Sundays, when
Hmm.
school, was really kind of out in the evenings, there was nothing in the community. So one of the things we fought for was a late night in the evening between 7 to like 11 or 12 to have recreation space for young people. So that opened, and that space still is happening. It's been 20 years or so now, and it's still operating. It's run by different people, and it has different people, young people using it and supporting some newcomer and some old people, whatever. But the space is still there, and it's important that and that's going to really build a community, right? It's been building community, it's been providing spaces for young people. So that was some of the areas I fought. The other area that we really saw a challenge was that voice. People had no voice.
Hmm.
Imagine thousands of people living in one community, and they're at the mercy of others.
Hmm.
They don't have any representation from their community speaking on their issues, fighting for change in their community, talking about the real lived experiences. And we began to add voice to that, to that concern, and that space is more challenging to address, because people are not also, they're not don't have a fixed address. Sometimes people are very transient, especially if you live in a rental or low income housing neighborhood.
Hmm.
People are moving back and forth, but that voice is very important. Integrating that in community is important, and that's what people know what's good for them, right? They know their needs.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my journey, and over the years I got involved, from there. I literally worked at every organization in Ottawa, whether it's the YMCA, YWCA, or the Youth Services Bureau, or the Pinecrest Queensway Community Health Center, the Britannia Woods. I volunteered at the Boys and Girls Club. I volunteered with a bunch of Somali led organizations. We started one of the biggest youth basketball leagues in Ottawa, and we had about 200 children per week. And the reason we started that basketball league, it was called the Somali Youth Basketball League, and it's funny because I think only 40% of the participants were Somali. But it started because we noticed that there wasn't really an outlet for
Hmm.
all these young talented people, a place for them to gather and a place to belong. So we would have between 8 and 12 teams across the city, from Russell Road to Canada, in between, and whether you're in Ritchie or Ramsey, and there's those areas, Caldwell, all the way in Jasmine and Overbrook. And over time, we for 12 years we ran that as a volunteer core friends, from the community who
Hmm.
all have lived experience, and we just wanted to have an impact on young people and also reduce conflict around geographical relations and so lack of um, friendships and relationships across different parts of the city.
Hmm.
So that was one of my biggest volunteer undertaking ever. I would never go back and do that because it was 12 years of losing every Saturday
Hmm.
and potentially some evenings just to that one thing. But it was rewarding because now it's I had a call from a young man who was a coach at the time, and he called me and said, "Look, I have this young kid. He's great. He needs a little bit of support. He needs some community hours. Can you help me get him a space?" And we were like, okay, well, let's work it out. So even though I've been out of it for 10, 15 years now, or 8, 9 years, it's still relevant and it's still there because people are always going to be there with needs, and relationships matter.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. Clearly, a lot of sacrifice, but as you said, very rewarding. The uh, I think in theory we all understand what it means when we say providing a space for the youth to be involved. For instance, in this case, something as simple as allowing them, for instance, giving them a space so that they can get together and play basketball. Uh, Concretely in the day to day, do you feel like you experienced a difference in those communities in terms of the youth, for instance, not getting in trouble, not instead of getting involved in crime and ending up in gangs and all sorts of other trouble? Did you actually live that and see it in a tangible way, or did it just kind of happen on its own?
Yes, I've seen a lot of success because of what's available to them, because of the spaces, because of the relationships, because of the intentional development that happens for them. I've seen change. The reality at the end of the day is that we live in a bigger society with much more deeper influences. You have your school influences and community influences, and you have family circumstances, and you have personal challenges as well. So when you combine all those things, there are people who are going to fall through the crack, and we need to remove some of the visible barriers. The systemic piece is becoming more and more simple that we
Hmm.
can do things better, whether it's in policing or in education. It's a fact. That the community, every time you talk to, it's clear. People know that this is something that's really pressing and is concerning. How people get services, huge concern. People want something that's relevant, appropriate, community-led, long-term and sustainable approaches to their needs. That isn't always the case, and we are often doing things from somebody else's experience. I think it's important that we think more and more of putting the power back into people's hands. So have things changed in terms of youth issues, whether it's substance use or gangs or school dropouts or unemployment, or bad habits and choices that happen every day. I think it's for some, but we can't. One is too many. If you have one young person who's struggling, I think we need to continue on that. um, Change will happen, as long as people are themselves are aware, and have space at the table, right? And that's not always the case, and it's often not the case. And until we do that, just because we have language barriers and we live in low income, doesn't mean that we don't have something to say, or we don't know what's good for us.
Hmm.
In fact, it's almost the other way around. But those of us who have the voice and the I guess the talents and the so-called expertise are often leading change for people. Sometimes that's that hindrance community progress, because it's not driven by community. It's not really rooted in community needs. It's kind of written, in our own minds that this is a solution. So for me, change needs to be grassroots. But and when it's not, then community needs to be, when it's targeted to them, they need to be there. There are large systems in our city now where people, services exist in abundance, but people don't use, and that's a real challenge. And the people, when you look at the data, the racialized or newcomer populations use certain set of services more, and not so much others.
Hmm.
We know there's a navigation and mediums that are needed to bridge that, but also need some voice to the table to say we need to change. the reasons why people are not coming to these services. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of building that we have to do as a city and as a community. And I'm often, my role now is a little bit different where I am. I'm not as involved in the frontline work, but I still have all my historical and community contacts to reflect. And I'm always championing, that community-led leadership leadership. And if you don't build leaders, this is the other part. People always drive agendas and issues, right? If you don't have leaders who are in the forefront of these issues, who are pushing, who are also bringing innovative and initiatives to the forefront, then change also slows that way, right? It's the same as the regular market. And
Hmm.
if people are not pushing, there's always a slowness, a slowing of ideas. So we also need, that's why we need community more and more. It's also to for them to lead.
Yeah.
Um,
So, I think I hear you loud and clear as you said that there's a necessity for the members of the community themselves to step up, to play leadership roles, to try to find a voice for themselves. Uh, but I think you also said something else, which is, this is a two-way dynamic relationship. So my question to you is, and I think you've been involved, and I'll get to your more professional experience and what you've witnessed as a professional. I'll get to that in a second
mhm,
because I'm very interested in that. But if we want to unpack this issue of the needs within the community,
right.
the capacity of the community to actually generate leaders, and then does the system offer a space for those leaders to voice their concerns? Is there kind of an awareness from the system in place
Yeah.
that this is what we're trying to do and we want the voice of the community and we're going to try to do things so that we actually increase leadership capacity from within the community? And is there stuff being done on the side of the community so that we increase this leadership role?
I've never seen that. The way you articulated, I've never seen any type of system that says this is a process or an approach you should use. I think what is necessary though is we need to be charitable, right? We need to open our eyes, because I think you figure things out
In
once you
it?
begin a journey, right?
Yes.
But to begin that journey, people really should pay attention to struggles, you know, and for every struggle in our society, often this is actually one of the things that I've often noticed that, well, what my friends who are sort of mainstream and don't have that sort of immigrant that have lived, generations in Canada, how they see struggle is different than how I see struggle. When I tell them a story, they panic and they go into, action mode. Sometimes in our communities, we see struggle and we normalize that. We see that as the norm. And to me, this is the one of the greatest obstacles to change. Is
Hmm.
sometimes is not being able to make certain issues a crisis. You would have, real deep issues. Let's just use, criminal issues in the community, for youth criminality, or involved in some type of violence. The root causes of that is very long. There's both historical and systemic and personal issues. But as a community, sometimes we never really vocalized, we never really spoke out, we never fought for those kids. There were times I felt like we let people down because we didn't really understand what struggle, we didn't understand that how that struggle, right, if although it impacts a small number of people, it's indicative of many other struggles in the community, right? Because that's the sort of the major climax in our community. Sometimes I find the newcomer more racialized, particularly the Muslim community. I notice there's tendency to not make small issues a crisis, big issues a crisis, and that hinders progress. So I think if we can understand wellness and how what a community ought
Hmm.
to be, and the ideals we want to see, and when we don't find that, then I think we need to really kind of push for change ourselves. And that's where you can bring your voice, right? You can't really bring your voice unless you can sort of identify what you want to talk about.
Hmm.
And that's where you begin championing for your community, and that's where you ask for change. So I think the biggest part of, in terms of a handbook of how to get involved and how to support community, it always comes down to the one person and then the few followers, But in the mainstream system, I think there are organizations who would help with that process. Going to your local city councilor, asking them for input and for strategies. Going to your, other elected officials, especially at the provincial level.
Mhm.
Going to your local community organizations, talking to your friends, both the ones from your community and the ones who are not from your community, because I guarantee you're going to get a different reaction.
Mhm.
So I think we are a community, and the solutions lie within our community always. But we need to come out. We need to tell the world that this is our thing, this is our
Mhm.
issue. And I think I've found that's how I found to be my best model is vocalizing it, saying it, talking to people about it,
Mhm.
and hopefully along the way somebody steps up to kind of pull you forward with, with
Mhm.
with with this idea or challenge you have.
Yeah, I think you just missed the first step, which is rolling up your sleeves and
Oh,
actually
right.
putting your hand in the dough and getting involved.
Absolutely.
But absolutely. So now let me switch gears to you've. I think a lot of the things you're talking about, a lot of it is more from, I'm going to call it volunteering work that you
Mhm.
do, and you're just direct involvement with the community. Um, what about your in your professional line of work? And I'm sure you're exposed to all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Does that change your perspective? What does that give you that you perhaps did not get or did not see right away as someone who is a volunteer? And I think this is kind of the additional perspective. So let's say we have some members in the community who are working,
Yeah.
who are trying to play that leadership role. Uh, are they missing something? Do they have blind spots? Because now you're part of the system
Mhm.
that is dealing in a lot of these things.
That's right.
And so, what's the perspective that we perhaps are missing there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Organizations are much like businesses in a lot of ways, and we have to be sort of view them that way in some cases because they have a very um, I have a mission statement, and that mission statement usually allows for them to do. They do want to ABC.
Yeah.
Community issues are ABC to Z, um, and one of the challenges, my most frustrating part of working in the larger systems is that you really want to get something done, but it's not really in your mandate, right? You're hired, or your organization's focus is ABC, and the needs are somewhere in
Yeah.
the H,
GH. Yeah.
right? And being creative enough within that space to address something that's outside of usually and not get into trouble as
Yeah.
well. Especially when I was the ED of one of the organizations, I had
ED
ability,
is what?
executive director of
Yeah.
one of the social service agency. I had an opportunity to, see things differently and also use my lived experience to respond to issues, particularly crisis, differently. And there were a lot of risks that
Yeah.
were outside of our mandate, um, that we participated in, uh, and many criticized, you know, particularly for our approach. I think that mindset is shifting now. People are seeing that, you can't separate certain things, but I think it's very challenging. That's why I personally believe that the system is for us,
Mhm.
right? It's for the people, and it takes the people to keep the system accountable. The absence of that, you don't really get very much. And that's why I don't think the focus should really be on so much on the organizations. But in this country, we don't have community rights. In most cases, we have individual rights,
Yeah.
right? And if the individual rights are really not respected, and I see that quite a bit, especially when it comes to the systemic and sort of blind spots, as you talked about, people's needs and not being seen or ignored, or that drive not being there, and sometimes fear
Yeah.
of engagement. But I think the people power is the power to the people is really sort of where any community organizing should focus on. The organizations are run by people like you and me and others in this room, and if they don't have that dialogue and that accountability built into their job, I think they can really get complacent. I've seen it, I've lived it, I've been there myself.
Yeah.
And it's important. Otherwise, I think organizations are, they do their best all the time with very limited resources in most cases. And the smaller they are, the more ingrained they are in community work.
Mhm.
And the bigger you are, the more vision focused you are. And sometimes sometimes you don't look left or right,
Mhm.
right? And you just stay on that track.
Yeah.
Those are sort of some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and there's a lot. My next question to you is going to be, and I don't know if I want to just keep it simple and throw it at you,
Go for it.
or add more questions in there. But to me, it's okay. So after all of this experience, and we've touched on so many things already, we talked about a whole lot of stuff, and they're not even of the same nature. Um, Today, obviously, we can't start everywhere. You have to start somewhere. If I want to get involved, if I want to try to do something, or if I want my voice to reach decision makers and those who have power to make change, what issues should I be raising that you would say, based on both just your direct involvement with community as well as your professional experience, what issues would you say, I don't know, your top two, top three, top five would be the ones that absolutely need an urgent addressing? And this is also something like, on one side, we need to raise the community's awareness about them, or maybe the community, you're going to tell me, already knows. And of course, we want to leverage the current systemic services, programs, and whatever else we can use. So, what would those be?
You know, it's different for everybody, and it's all dependent on your position. But I have a feeling that many of our communities, particularly, our topic was focused on sort of newcomer people living in sort of a low income, middle income, uh, traditionally newer,
And the youth within
and
that.
and young, and their the families and the children.
Yeah.
Um, I think if you don't address housing,
Mhm.
how people, where they live and how they live, and also how they're kind of um, being supported in those communities they are, because Ottawa is the city of wide geographic differences, and geography is usually associated with income.
Yeah.
And it's also associated with uh, certain demographics, right? The area I live in is highly, we have more senior people. It's a more established neighborhood, right? But when I was living in Ritchie and in Bayshore, we were low income to a point where I would ask people to drop me off on Carling because I didn't want them to know where I lived. So I think we need to pay attention, because to me that's a terrible story, right? When you really think about the shame that came to where we lived, and I wasn't the only one, and also not being able to get a job because of the address, and being forced to change your address because somebody wouldn't hire you because of, right, where you lived. So I think housing is a really, communities are geographic in our cases.
Yeah.
The ethnocultural communities are more based on the cultural connections and identity. But I think the biggest commonality now, what I see, is a geographical concentration. And those neighborhoods I just named, you can associate how many friends you have in those communities. The other second part is support for families, children, women, youth, and because that is really the potential of young people, is important for us as a society. It's not just about jobs and careers, but it's also their health and their happiness, their formative years. But down the road, also as people who are able to support themselves, support society, and be leaders and so on. So losing one person's potential in our community is a potential that we all of us lost, and that perpetuates future challenges as well. So it's important that we consider, when I say families, women are the forefront often, of our families, children and youth, and a lot of the, many fathers who came here, their careers have been stopped, and are doing very odd jobs to just get by, but they also need support. So just think about the family dynamics is important in our community.
Yeah.
But also the other big part is just the wellness support, social services, mental health programs, economic opportunities. Those are some of the other issues I think that our communities need. Above all, though, I noticed that it's just having The biggest issue for me is creating enough space for people to belong, to say this is my spot. Because if you don't really move if you don't believe in something, you're not going to do it. And sometimes I feel people don't believe they can get out of where they are. So that we need people to believe in that, in our community, in our city, in our country. If we don't have that, it's going to be tough. So that, that believing means, it all means belonging. It all means having access, right? Jobs need to be specific for people, that they need to have some opportunities that are geared to their particular needs. Other support systems, training, loans, for entrepreneurship. All, if you look at all those indicators, they're really low, 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 low for certain populations. And as long as that kind of culture maintains, you're not really going to support people. There's got to be targeted approaches for the various layers of needs in our community. And this is where politicians and community leaders, and faith-based organizations and others really need to champion that. We need to focus, because some of the stuff that we've been doing is kind of ignoring. And there's some of the issues are deepening and deepening. We have an opportunity now with this pandemic, and the crisis that came with it, and the how it highlights or amplified some of the historical challenges. I think this is a time for us to start shifting, and it's important for now the citizen. Remember, we talked about the most important player in all of this is us, the people. If the people are really about it, it would reflect in society, right? This is why I'm a big fan that we look at our individual efforts, those of us who can. There are more of us who can, who do nothing, and there are more people who can't, who actually keep trying, right? And this is where it's very important that those are high level issues, but at the end of the day, it's change happens with you and me and our friends and family and our table conversations and so on.
Yeah, I think that's such a key, crucial point that you just said there at the end. That, I think the situation is not the same as, for instance, it was perhaps, 2 decades or more ago. For instance, when you came, clearly, I think we have a lot more people who have grown up in the system, who understand the system, who can help a lot more than perhaps 2 or 3 decades ago,
Absolutely.
when the communities were not this mature yet. But the issues are still there. So there's certainly, I think, from what I hear, there's a greater leadership need for people to step up from within the community.
Yeah, well, and you're seeing this with I would say, in the millennium. Well, the millennials are big voice in our community now. So, but even more, I think younger, educated youth are for so far the most formidable activists and change makers in our society, and many of them are also coming from lived experience. I look at even the BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, and how it just unapologetically kept going, and their stands were not popular from the beginning. Everybody's recognizing them now, but they went through a lot of struggle just to get their message out. I think that's sort of a clear example of group that went for exactly what the issues were, and fought. But there are so many in between that and community, and I believe change is coming. We just need to want what we want for ourselves, for others, right? And make sure that we don't leave some of our community members behind. And it's just a lot of special interest groups, and there are many other factors that also sustain, right, oppression and marginalization. And we also need to be considerate of all those pieces and make sure that we are. That's why being at the table is important, because you get to speak on those issues and raise.
Do you feel currently you're, and I don't know to what extent you are directly or not involved. I think you're very directly involved at the grassroots level, but maybe at the more organizational level within the communities. If to what extent would you say there is awareness and there is capacity and work actually being done in this regard?
Absolutely, there's a lot of awareness. If I notice one thing, it's there's a lot of awareness. Um, would that be actionable awareness? Is another question. That all depends on the people. because all of us, whether you are the mainstream level sort of executive or you're the grassroots community, so person, there's always there's a point of attention, right?
Yes.
3 4 months things are hot, everybody's kind of working to get things done, but I've noticed that things just go back to the
Cool down.
normal,
Yeah.
right? And as long as we're able to create those spaces where there is long-term longevity
Yeah.
and long-term building and genuinely caring about our community together, but also being very firm about where our stands are,
Yeah.
I think we'll get results. But we need to keep no cooling down, right? This is the challenge. We often go, it's a go and stop,
Mhm.
stop and go type of strategy.
So now, as a professional working in this field,
Yeah.
um, what does it look like to do advocacy work? If I want to get involved, what would that look like for me? And if I wanted to take it all the way to becoming a professional,
Yeah.
and this could apply to me and it could apply to the youth listening to you
Yeah.
now, saying, one day maybe this is really important work and I want to contribute to my community. And what is the potential for actual change that I can, effect
Well,
in society?
speaking for others I mean, that's sort of where I don't have voice. Um, you know, um, some would say silence is violence in some ways, because sometimes our silence is greatest contributor of oppression and whatnot. So advocacy for me comes from a place of responsibility, and I think advocacy is very simple. It's not about, the biggest activists I see often are elderly people
Mhm.
in our community. No one knows them as activists, but they really kind of look at things from wrong and right, and sometimes you might not agree with their point of view, but they know what they're fighting against.
Yeah.
And I think for people, and they're clear, right? So I think people need to really pick on what they see. It's, being a professional activist is never going to happen because you're always kind of picking on issues, or you're focusing on single issue.
Yeah.
Sometimes it'll be like, the humane society sort of animal welfare. Some people are just passionate about that.
Mhm.
Other people, it's about prison rights, right? And other people, it's about health access and education support, right? And sometimes about supporting young people and children and so on. Sometimes NGO work around the world, and gender-based violence and so on. So the issues are many. You just got to pick what's close to you, what's close to your heart, and what you see in your community, and be persistent about it.
Mhm.
I think people will always respect the person who goes out and says, "I want to make the world a better place,"
Mhm.
because that's what advocacy is supposed to be. So that's usually my line of support for people who are doing is being genuinely interested in and having a focus.
Mhm. And once you're in the system, I guess that's the perhaps less more difficult question to say. To what extent do you feel like you can actually affect change? Do you often hit brick walls? Do you feel like right now the huge buzzword is systemic racism
Right.
and discrimination, and do you feel like there's enough in the system for you to keep you hopeful and optimistic and keep working, or are there a lot of roadblocks and barriers and things that you keep it's constantly an uphill battle with no end in sight?
That's often what happens to a lot of people, believe it or not. It's even when you think you're close to success, there's just so many challenges. That's why it's important that you're going in with sort of an end to your goals on advocacy, but at the same time, sometimes it's lifelong battle.
Mhm.
The issue of systemic racism is great, and I think a federal government, for example, is just really championing and leading the way. I think it's going to trickle down. It already is. So the people who are fighting for that, I think they're going to see some real change. But as we've experienced historically, because if you really, if you're a student of history as well, you'll see that it isn't about one approach. Also, there are a multitude of factors, and for me, the biggest focus is people who are not able to access these opportunities that come with systemic
Mhm.
barriers. Sometimes they're outliers; they're not even in the system. There are people who are young people who are couch surfing, and they're not on any support system. They're maintaining their life by being involved in difficult situations, right? Those people's lives are not really going to be changed, right? Those professionals who are now working in, who have education and resources, who would have succeeded anyways, will continue to succeed. I hope we don't forget that it's a multi-pronged strategy, and that we also focus on the people who are most in need.
Hmm. Yeah, the more vulnerable, the
Mhm.
most vulnerable. Yeah. The giving voice to the community. Do you run into issues where you feel like it's the community is too fragmented, where it's difficult to kind of give one voice or to prioritize one thing?
Yeah.
And what happens then?
Because I don't speak for the community. Right. This is the important part. I think we speak on issues,
Hmm.
right? We speak on people's lives. I don't think I ever represented. I might have done one day, but that was full consent provided. But I've never spoken on community-wide issues. You obviously mentioned some communities if you're speaking on, if you want to
Hmm.
be clear. But I think we in the society we are, we don't have to worry about community fragmentation and unity. I've never really run into those type of issues, because when you're also doing good,
Hmm.
and people know that you have right intentions,
Yeah.
and you're not doing this for the 2 day, to the limelight,
Yeah.
then you get the endorsement of the community. But more importantly, I think it's good that we engage. You are who you are.
Hmm.
Like, always sees me like Mohammed. If somebody needs something from the Somali community, they'll identify me as a Somali, a Canadian who is gonna maybe be a gateway. So people always contact you for that,
Yeah.
reason. But at the end of the day, I have never worked with a Somali organization formally. Right, everything I've done, it was for my community, and my community included everybody. Have Somalis been, benefited from me being there, and speaking out and being part of the community? Absolutely, and so have so many others, right? So I think it's important that our lens of community, for me, it's pretty wide
Yeah.
and broad, but also I am who I am
Yes.
at the end of the day. And it's important that we go with that the sort of broad sense, and just be there for people,
Yeah.
and speak on their issues. But that means you have to be connected as well, right? You can't just speak unless you are. That's how you get credibility, being part of your
Yes.
community.
Yes. So now let's say I'm someone who is working as within these programs at the federal or at the provincial or even at the municipal level.
Mhm.
I am managing these programs. How do I know, or to what extent would you say that we are reaching the right people? You've mentioned the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
You mentioned different issues that the youth may be facing. Some of them are maybe not directly youth issues, but they have a direct impact on the youth, either right now or in the future,
Yeah.
housing and so on and so forth. Um, so, and you've talked, I think, at length about everything that the community can do to help itself. But now, from the more
System. Yeah.
policy and programs
Yeah.
perspective,
Yeah.
um, are we reaching the right people? And if not, what needs to be done so that we go and find them in the right place?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the
No,
whole
I
targeting,
no. Yeah.
scoping, targeting. Yeah,
Well, we have a challenge to that. So governments or government agencies usually are, they've uh, they usually work through non-for-profits
hmm,
for their programs. They don't run themselves. Very limited programs do governments run. The direct payouts, such as ODSP and Ontario Works, these are people with disabilities and people on social welfare. Those are more direct government to people support.
hmm,
Even in many cases, there's a municipal um,
intermediary.
intermediary in that. But otherwise, government's usually using a third party to deliver services. Where you run into challenges, the vast majority of the third parties also don't have the lived experience, don't have the lived experience leadership, don't have that diversity that's necessary for engagement of the right people. and I think it's incumbent on policymakers and particularly those who are addressing issues of youth employment, some of the sort of soft services, to diversify, right, and invest even on a pilot basis. And there have been some success, I think, in the Ontario government,
Mhm.
both the previous Wynne government and Mr. Ford's government here have who's agreed to continue, have started the anti-racism secretariat in Ontario, and that did not was not an empty promise. It came with resources to community-led um, uh,
Initiatives and
initiatives.
programs.
And
Yeah.
at the time, I think it started with Black community initiatives, and it focused on the Black youth. It was actually called the Black Youth Action Plan. I thought that was a very smart way of rolling it out,
Mhm.
and they partnered with the community to actually co-design what was a practical approach to community, so solutions. They focus on parenting and youth and early intervention and preventive programs for young people.
Mhm.
I think similar model. There are a lot of models out there, but sometimes the bigger and the better and stronger, as our society often is, get the resources.
Mhm.
And I don't think there are a lot that's going to change very much.
Yeah,
So
so it brings us back to the starting point of the need for the community to
voice,
capacity building within the
absolutely,
community, leadership within the community, and giving
S-
voice, right?
absolutely, spaces, investing in space for people, investing in resourcing some of those organizations
Yeah.
who are doing community work. I told you, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I know very few women, I would say 4 or 5 women, who probably do themselves more work than organizations do in the community,
Yeah,
uh,
single-handedly on their
single-handedly.
own.
And those women and their vans and the amount of goods I
Yes.
call inventory, they carry on those vans, and sometimes they get hurt, and I watch them doing that work, and it's difficult when how do you not help those people, right? They're doing the ultimate community work, but they're outliers. They're not doing it because they're part of they just do it. This is their
Yes, they're not part
reaction.
of a bigger logistic
Ex-
operation
Exactly.
organization.
Exactly. And no one will recognize that contribution. Very
It's
rare.
invisible.
It's very invisible. And
Yeah.
this is often the story of a community. That's why I think we have a responsibility to be sometimes speak the truth on some of the realities.
Yeah.
But over time, I feel when I was here, when I was involved in this community 18 years ago, let's say, and today the big difference is critical mass. There weren't as many, you know, I was say mentioning earlier, even the number of mosques in Ottawa
Hmm.
went from one to like 6 big ones now, or five. But it shows you the growth that there's a buzz. There are leaders. There's community. There's economic opportunity. There are connectivities and dialogues happening. People from different backgrounds, different resources, different. You have a faith-based person who's talking to a community person. You have a business person talking to community and faith, and there's a triangle thing going on. I think they're talking to the greater system. I think a lot of good is happening, but we still need that. There's still a little bit more, growing we have to do. But I hope governments recognize that type of dynamic and
Hmm.
so organic happenings in community and get into the forefront to capture that energy and growth and energy happening in the community.
Yeah, I think from hearing you talk, I have the impression that what you see is a lot of good work, but perhaps not as organized or coordinated as it could be.
Yeah, and in the social services or non-for-profit organizations,
That's a reality.
that's a very simple reality. There are probably about 80,000 non-for-profits in Ontario alone, and they go from very small food centers to farm aid groups to
Mhm.
senior support groups to social services and health providers and so on. So I don't think organizing is the focus here. I think it's civic engagement. So
Mhm.
getting people to vote, organizing get out the vote campaigns, voting for the right people. To me, those are quick return on your time.
Yeah.
You'll get the right people elected. You get the right people to do the right policies, to
Mhm.
invest in the right things. You are engaged as well as a member of society. I think if we're doing those things, and if we're active in our communities, and we continue to build the organizations that are building, economic opportunities between people is important. Relationships are important. Mentorship is important,
Yeah.
right? That dynamic, that cross cultural learning,
Yeah.
whether you're an Arab or a Black or Asian or whatever. I think that cross-cultural relationships are also important, and in, of course, you have a huge mainstream community, which sometimes I feel like I'm part of it, and right, and others, because we are part of so much of the system sometimes that we are kind of mainstream, right?
Of course.
So we also have to recognize our own privileges as we are, have lots of it. And that doesn't mean people with privilege can do good. Often it's those people who are doing a lot of work,
Hmm.
right? And I can tell millions of stories about that, but it's not co-opting the real issues, right? And not turning into some kind of marketing, or right. It's being genuine and fighting the issues where they are.
Yeah, at the root
Right?
causes and going
Yeah,
going after those.
yeah.
I feel it's been a your journey is rich, fascinating. You probably feel, I don't know, hearing you talk, I have an impression you bounced around a little bit, but there's been kind of a common thread or common theme bringing all of this varied experience together.
Yeah.
Um, so if there's youths out there listening to you at that age where they can do something and they're looking at their future
Yeah.
and they know that they can get involved and um, what would you tell them? And I think you already said a lot of those things, but if you were to address them directly,
Yeah.
to talk to them directly, uh, where should they be putting their energy? What should they be doing? All of that.
There's when I was about 19, someone I met a good friend, who's still a great friend, and uh, I had a different upbringing. I didn't grow up with my parents. I was independent from probably at the age of 8. But that means I missed quite a bit of milestones.
Of course.
Right. Let's be, and that struggle I think is faced by a lot of people. But at 19, I met a good friend, and someone asked me, this, you really gotta like take it easy and get to know yourself, right? Like listen to yourself, figure out who you are. And I thought that was the most revealing thing that anybody has ever said to me was, get to know yourself,
Mhm.
turn off the noise. Because I think you drive yourself when you're young, and for youth out there between the age of 12 and 25, the world is yours to make whatever you want it to be.
Mhm.
Um, but sometimes you have to change your approach. Sometimes you have to test. Sometimes you have to dream. Sometimes have to get well, and sometimes you need to make new friends. And so for me, for young people, it begins with good, reliable friends who are there for you and who are able to push you to meet your goals. And before the friends, you need to know who you are and make your own goals.
Mhm.
And don't be afraid. The world, despite your challenges, some of those challenges are going to be your biggest assets.
Mhm.
That struggle is probably going to build who you are, and you're going to have that edge over others because of your lived experience. That your understanding of things, your relationships, your all of those things will turn to an asset if you stay on the right course, if you keep pushing, if you keep
Mhm.
your family relation, all those things that are annoying right now are eventually going to be really great. But you also gotta, if you're struggling, find a way to
To
talk to
deal with
someone.
it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yes,
talk to
get it done.
someone. Reach out for support. you know Everything you do, I think your teenage to youth ages up to like 25 to 30, even 35 for some people, I think it's all within your power. And I think, you know for me, it hasn't been easy.
Mhm.
And it's important to know that it hasn't been easy for many people, but they've overcome, and they overcame normally because of the help of others.
I don't think the importance of role models or people to look up to can be overstated. I think this is well known,
Absolutely.
and uh, if you want to get personal or not, you tell me. But In your case, do you feel like you had the role models that you were looking up to, or did you feel like you were making it up as you had to because that's the situation that you were in?
Yeah.
And then, again, addressing the youth of today. What does that look like?
Yeah, I was stubborn and I was a quick learner. So
So you made your own mistakes.
so and you know what? Honestly, like I think mentors are wonderful assets. You have to be the best to yourself, right? Because no one will be good to you if you're not good to yourself. I had so many profound mentors throughout my life. Mostly later in my life, I would
Mhm.
say beyond my high school days.
Stubborn years? No.
Yeah, but yeah, the stubborn years were like, you run around your friends, you think you know everything. But one someone once said to me, we were talking about the issue of racism,
Yeah.
and this was, like probably 1999. I was working for someone, Christine Cullum, actually, who lives out in BC now. And she said, look, we're talking about same conversation we're having, right? This is way back, right?
Mhm.
20 plus years ago. Frustrated young person, right? And one of the most important things she said to me was, yes, there's absolutely racism. There's You're gonna face some days, you're gonna really be brutal. Just realize that.
Real
Number
talk.
one. Right? Second thing, you can use it to your advantage.
Mhm.
Find a way, because of everything you do, just keep at right those things. So I think I've always looked at life like nothing is going to be easy.
Mhm.
Like I think that's sort of some of the self-help books will tell you that, right? Life is hard. Just right, there'll be trials and there'll be success and there'll be
Mhm.
tears and there'll be, like lots of joy.
Mhm.
But you can't have joy without knowing also struggle. Like it doesn't work like that. So I think struggle is completely fine. You just need to know how to go through it. And mentorship, biggest mentors have been my source. Really, family is big because you don't need to talk to a mentor to see to see what they're about.
Mhm.
You can just look,
Yeah.
right, and feel. For me, it wasn't so much about I remember when I was in grade 10, there was a one man, Welly, who was with I think it was a multicultural worker, community worker at the time. He used to come to a little center near where I lived, and he would arrive around 8:30 or so in the morning. I would go there just to have that morning conversation before he began his day. And he was the first professional, I think, immigrant or Somali black person I saw at the time. Just having, I remember him telling him that, because I'm struggling with English, 'cause I'm so new to Canada, that I was using a lot of close notes and glossary, like bunch of other. I was borrowing from the book, the short notes
Yeah.
from the library or online or whatever. And then and he's like, "That's a great skill." I thought it was a horrible thing to do. It's
Yeah.
like
You
that's a
felt like
great
you're
skill,
cheating. Yeah.
exactly. He's like, "You should keep doing that. That's a good skill, right?" But sometimes you need the affirmation. But often you're seeing people,
Yeah.
and when you see, you can also imitate what they're doing, right? I can follow a lot of great leaders without ever they're gone, they're
Interacting with them
deceased.
directly. Yes.
Exactly. We follow, the Sahaba and others, their footsteps, because not because we read and we feel what their good stories and deeds and
Mhm.
right practices. So I think part of mentorship is holistic. You can, it's very much about an informed person and wanting and needing to do
Mhm.
something, right? It's beyond. So I think open your eyes for sure, and enjoy life, and know that life is full of struggle.
Mhm. Well, I think whether you realize it or not, and whether you, as you said, you've had all sorts of different mentorship relationships, as you're saying about yourself. But just listening to you talk, and I'm sure there's so many more years of this type of work that you're gonna be involved in one way or another, because I feel it's really in your blood. But there's, I think no two ways about it that you already have a legacy in place, and I think there's a lot of youth who can learn a lot from you, just how you have kind of stepped up, played that leadership role, filled a vacuum and a gap, and perhaps today it's not that same gap that exists, perhaps it's another
It's a
one.
different, yeah.
So each one of those youth
Yeah.
has to see what works for them.
Yeah.
But I think there's certainly a role model figure in you that people can recognize, and I hope that you're open to people reaching out to you if they need to. Uh,
Absolutely, yeah. I appreciate those kind words. I've never seen the thought about the legacy part. It was really more a knee jerk reaction, right? Like I said earlier, it's we respond to our surrounding.
Reactive
Yeah,
always. Yeah.
yeah. If there's prey, we run, and if not, we yeah. So
Yes.
there are challenges, and I'm glad to have been. You know, it's a real joy to be part of your community because I feel, I didn't say this, but I feel the community supported me more than I've supported it. So, in many ways, even from wellness being and socially being active, those are good things as well. And we didn't talk about, how that being part of a community is also it's full of opportunities. You never know who you might meet.
It's rewarding. It's not
Yeah,
just a give relationship, right?
exactly. Very
And you
rewarding.
might be taking even more than you're giving.
Absolutely. Sometimes, yeah, personally, when you look at it from when you benefit from well-being part and that growth, you get more for sure.
Well, on this, I think we're gonna stop here. We've covered a lot.
You did.
Thank you very much for your openness, your transparent personal style, the leadership sacrifice stories that you shared with us. And I think we touched on a lot of things that are very real, from the grassroots all the way to the systemic programs and policies, and how to get involved. And we touched on leadership. So hopefully, there's a lot there to take to raise awareness and for us to kind of act on and take this to the next level.
I
So
Yeah, no, I appreciate coming in, and I thank the Arc Center for hosting this. I think this will be great, interaction and transfer knowledge as well for our community.
thank you very much. And to our dear viewers, hopefully soon you'll join us on another episode of Muslim Youth Matters. And thank you all. Take care.